Picture this, a world sliced in two, not by geography, but by ideas. One side championed freedom and capitalism, the other, equality and communism. This wasn't a war of bombs and bullets, at least, not directly. This was the Cold War, a decades-long standoff between superpowers, a clash of ideologies that reshaped the globe. It all began in the aftermath of World War II, a time when the world yearned for peace, but found itself on the brink of a new kind of conflict. From 1945 to 1991, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a high-stakes game of chess where the pieces were nations, the moves were political maneuvers, and the threat of nuclear annihilation loomed large. You're watching History Deciphered with Nathan Gale, and today we're diving deep into the origins of this chilling rivalry. Let's get started. So, 1945, World War II is finally over. Cities are in ruins, millions are displaced, and the old powers of Europe, like Britain and France, are, well, exhausted. They're just not in any shape to call the shots anymore. This created what historians call a power vacuum. It's like, imagine a playground with no teacher. Suddenly, two of the strongest kids, in this case, the US and the Soviet Union, see an opportunity to take charge. The US emerges from the war with a booming economy and, let's be real, the ultimate power move, the atomic bomb. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, despite suffering unimaginable losses, over 20 million people, has this massive land army and a deep-seated need for security. Seriously, after being invaded by Napoleon and then Hitler, can you blame them for being a little paranoid? These two giants, while allies during the war, had fundamentally different worldviews. The US championed capitalism and democracy, free markets, individual rights, the whole 9 yards. The Soviets, on the other hand, believed in communism, state control, collective ownership, equality, even if it meant sacrificing some freedoms. It was a recipe for tension, a clash waiting to happen. All right, so picture this. February 1945. The war's still raging, but the end is in sight. Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin, the big three, meet in Yalta, a resort town in Crimea. It's like a tense family dinner where everyone's trying to decide who gets what after Grandpa kicks the bucket. Except Grandpa is Nazi Germany and the inheritance is Europe. They agree to divide Germany into 4 zones, one for each of the Allied powers, the US, Britain, France, and of course, the Soviet Union. They also promise free and fair elections in Eastern Europe, countries newly liberated from Nazi control. It sounds great on paper, right? A peaceful transition to democracy. Everyone gets a slice of the cake. Except, well, Stalin had other plans. Here's the thing. Stalin saw Eastern Europe as essential to Soviet security, a buffer zone against future invasions. He wasn't about to let these countries become Western-leaning democracies. So, he starts installing communist governments loyal to Moscow, completely ignoring the promises made at Yalta. This was a major red flag for the US and Britain. They saw it as a blatant power grab, a betrayal of trust, and the first domino to fall in a communist takeover of Europe. The seeds of mistrust, planted right there in the sunny Crimean Peninsula, started to sprout. So, Stalin's got his grip on Eastern Europe. He's setting up communist regimes in Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, you name it. He calls it a buffer zone, like a giant cushion against future attacks. And honestly, given Russia's history, constantly invaded by Napoleon, then Hitler, you can kind of see his paranoia. I mean, the Soviets lost over 20 million people in World War II. That's a staggering number, absolutely devastating. It's no wonder Stalin was obsessed with security. But here's the US and Britain saw it very differently. They weren't buying the defense argument. To them, it looked like aggressive expansion, the first step in a communist world domination plot. It's this fundamental clash of perspectives, this inability to see the other side's point of view, that really fuels the early Cold War tensions. Take Poland, for example. The Soviets rigged the 1947 elections to ensure a communist victory, completely disregarded the Yalta Agreement about free elections. Moves like this convinced the West that Stalin couldn't be trusted, that he was playing a different game altogether. It's like playing chess, and suddenly your opponent flips the board over and declares themselves the winner. Not cool, Stalin. Now, picture this. March 1946. Winston Churchill, no longer Prime Minister, but still a powerful voice, gives a speech in Fulton, Missouri. And it's not just any speech. It's a speech that sends shockwaves across the world. He talks about an Iron Curtain descending across Europe, dividing it between East and West, between Soviet control and, well, everyone else. This wasn't just a catchy phrase, though. It was a stark image that captured the growing divide. Churchill's words really crystallized the situation for many, particularly in America. It woke them up to the reality of the Soviet threat. Before this, many Americans saw the Soviets as wartime allies, tough, but ultimately on the same side. Churchill's Iron Curtain metaphor made it clear this wasn't a temporary disagreement. It was a serious, potentially long-term, ideological conflict. And that key quote, right? From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. It's one of the most famous lines of the 20th century, instantly iconic. It's seriously chilling when you think about it. A physical barrier separating families, nations, ideas. Though there wasn't a literal wall yet, the phrase perfectly captured the feeling of division and the growing sense of unease. The Iron Curtain speech was a turning point in how the West perceived the Soviets, transforming them from uneasy allies to a genuine threat. So Churchill's speech really laid bare the growing divide between East and West. And less than a year later, in March 1947, President Truman steps up and makes a move that fundamentally shifts US foreign policy. This is where the Truman Doctrine comes in. Here's the deal. Greece was fighting a civil war against communist rebels, and Turkey was facing pressure from the Soviet Union, particularly over control of the Dardanelles, a crucial waterway. Both countries were teetering on the edge, and it looked like they might fall into the Soviet sphere of influence. Truman went to Congress and asked for $400 million in aid for Greece and Turkey. That's a big chunk of change, even today. But it was a massive amount back then. But it wasn't just about the money, it was about the message. Truman basically said, look, the US is going to support any nation resisting communism, anywhere in the world. This was a bold statement, and it marked the beginning of what became known as the containment policy. Containment was the idea that the US needed to stop communism from spreading, to contain it like a fire. And this, right here, is a huge shift. The US was no longer just reacting to Soviet moves, it was proactively declaring its intention to fight communist influence globally. The Truman Doctrine, as dry as it may sound, was a declaration of Cold War. It's the US drawing a line in the sand, saying we're not backing down. The Truman Doctrine had an immediate impact. The aid helped Greece and Turkey stabilize, keeping them from falling under Soviet sway. But, even more importantly, it set the stage for decades of US foreign policy focused on containing communism. This policy shaped everything from the Marshall Plan to the Korean and Vietnam Wars. It's seriously a pivotal moment in the Cold War story. Alright, so the Truman Doctrine was about holding the line, right? Containing communism. But then comes the Marshall Plan, and this is where things get really interesting. It's June 1947, and Europe is still a mess after World War II. I mean, bombed out cities, shattered economies, people struggling just to survive. It was a breeding ground for instability, and the US was worried that desperation might push more countries towards communism. So, Secretary of State George Marshall comes up with this audacious idea. He proposes a massive aid package to rebuild Europe. We're talking $13 billion. That's the equivalent of something like $150 billion today. It was a staggering amount of money. The plan was to pump this cash into Western European countries to get their economies back on their feet. The goal wasn't just about being nice, though. It was a strategic move. The US believed that a prosperous Europe would be less susceptible to communist influence. It was a smart move, a combination of humanitarian aid and clever realpolitik. It was like, let's rebuild these economies, create strong democracies, and make communism look less appealing. Now, the Soviets and their Eastern European allies were also offered this aid, but Stalin saw it as a Trojan horse. He viewed the Marshall Plan as a way for the US to buy influence and undermine his control over Eastern Europe. He refused the aid for himself and pressured his satellite states to do the same. This is a critical turning point. The Soviet rejection of the Marshall Plan further solidified the division of Europe. Western Europe, with US assistance, began to recover rapidly. Factories started humming again, shops reopened, and people's lives began to improve. Meanwhile, Eastern Europe, cut off from this aid, lagged behind, creating an even starker contrast between the two halves of the continent. This economic disparity further widened the gap between East and West, deepening the Cold War divide. It's like two kids in a sandbox, one with all the toys, thanks to a generous parent, and the other left with nothing, feeling resentful and isolated. It's not a recipe for friendship, that's for sure. So, the Marshall Plan is in motion, Western Europe is getting back on its feet, and Stalin's watching all of this unfold. He's not thrilled, to say the least. He sees this massive influx of American aid as a direct threat to his sphere of influence, and he's not about to let it go unchallenged. It's like a chess match, and he needs to make his next move. And that move? The formation of Cominform, the Communist Information Bureau. It's October 1947, and Stalin gathers communist parties from across Europe, creating this organization to coordinate their activities and push back against the growing influence of the West. It's like he's creating his own team to counter the US and its allies. Cominform wasn't just about sharing information, it was about consolidating Soviet control. It became a tool for enforcing ideological purity within the Eastern Bloc. Think of it as a way to keep everyone on the same page, singing from the same hymn sheet, so to speak. Any dissent or deviation from the party line was swiftly dealt with. This really formalized the ideological struggle. It's not just a clash of ideas anymore, it's a structured, organized opposition. The creation of Cominform is like drawing a line in the sand. It solidifies the division of Europe into two opposing camps. It ramps up the tension, setting the stage for the decades-long standoff that would define the Cold War. It's like two rival gangs staking out their territory, each vying for dominance. So, let's take a step back and recap what we've covered so far. Why did this whole Cold War thing even start? Well, it's a bit of a tangled web, but here's the gist. First, you have this fundamental clash of ideologies. Capitalism versus communism. It's like mixing oil and water. The US championed free markets and individual liberties, while the Soviet Union was all about state control and a classless society. Two completely different visions for the future. Then, there's the power vacuum left by World War II. Europe was in ruins, and the old powers were weakened, creating this void that both the US and the Soviet Union wanted to fill. It's like two heavyweight boxers stepping into the ring, ready to duke it out for the title. Next, we've got Soviet expansionism. Stalin, paranoid after the devastating losses the Soviet Union suffered during the war, wanted a buffer zone of friendly nations on his borders. He saw it as a matter of survival, but the West viewed it as aggressive expansion, a power grab. It's like a game of Risk, where one player starts gobbling up territories, making everyone else nervous. And finally, you have the US policy of containment. Worried that communism would spread like wildfire, the US adopted a strategy of containing it, preventing it from spreading any further. This was a major turning point, solidifying the adversarial relationship between the two superpowers. Okay, so those are the main sparks that ignited the Cold War. But what were the long-term consequences? Well, first and foremost, Europe was divided. Churchill's Iron Curtain became a stark reality, splitting the continent into two armed camps. This division would shape the political landscape for decades to come. Then, you have the formation of military alliances, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. It's like choosing sides for a schoolyard brawl, except the stakes are incredibly high. Each side amassed a huge arsenal of weapons, creating an arms race that threatened the very existence of humanity. And finally, there were the proxy wars, Korea, Vietnam, and others. These were hot conflicts fought in the shadow of the Cold War, where the superpowers supported opposing sides, but never directly engaged each other. It's like two chess players battling it out, not by moving their own pieces, but by manipulating other countries like pawns. All right, so we've laid out the key events, but here's the thing. History isn't always black and white. It's more like a messy, tangled up ball of yarn. Everyone saw the start of the Cold War a little differently, depending on where they were standing. Let's start with the US perspective. They genuinely believed the Soviets were out to destroy democracy and take over the world. Truman, the guy who took over after Roosevelt, saw Stalin's broken promises at Yalta as proof of Soviet bad faith. It's like lending your friend your favorite video game, and they not only never return it, but also claim they never borrowed it in the first place. That breeds distrust, right? Truman's famous quote, "We must support free peoples resisting communism," became a rallying cry, justifying America's interventionist policies. Then there's the Soviet perspective. From Stalin's point of view, the West, particularly the US, was a threat to his communist revolution. He saw them as capitalist vultures circling, waiting for the Soviet Union to collapse. He felt trapped, like the US was using its economic might to bully him. One Soviet official, Molotov, even called the Marshall Plan political pressure with dollars. It's like someone offering you a gift with strings attached, the kind that makes you feel indebted and obligated. And then there's Europe, caught in the middle of this superpower tug of war. Western European countries like France were devastated by the war and desperately needed help rebuilding. They welcomed US aid and saw it as a lifeline against the spread of communism. On the other hand, Eastern Europeans, like those in Hungary, had no say in their fate. They were under Soviet control, and any resistance was brutally suppressed. It's like being forced to choose a side in a fight you don't even want to be a part of. Even historians can't agree on who was responsible. Some, the traditionalists, point the finger squarely at Stalin and his aggressive expansion into Eastern Europe. They say, look, he rigged elections in Poland, installed puppet regimes, clearly the aggressor. Then you have the revisionists, who argue that the US pushed its economic agenda too hard, using the Marshall Plan to buy influence and create a bloc of anti-Soviet states. They say, hey, the US wasn't so innocent either. Most historians today, though, take a more nuanced view. They recognize that both sides share blame, driven by fear, mistrust, and miscommunication. It's less about assigning blame and more about understanding the complex interplay of factors that led to this global standoff. So, whose fault was the Cold War? It's seriously complicated. It's like trying to figure out who started an argument in a big, noisy family. Everyone has their own version of the story, and the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. So, let's rewind and recap. From 1945 to 1947, the world went from celebrating the end of a devastating war to holding its breath at the start of a new kind of conflict, the Cold War. It wasn't a war of bombs and bullets, at least not directly, but a war of ideas, of influence, a constant low hum of tension that stretched across the globe. We saw how the seeds of this conflict were sown, from the rubble of World War II to the tense negotiations at Yalta, the broken promises, the Soviet expansion into Eastern Europe, Churchill's chilling Iron Curtain speech, and the US response with the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. By 1947, with the formation of Cominform, the lines were drawn. The stage was set for a decades-long standoff between two superpowers. This wasn't just about disagreements. It was a fundamental clash of worldviews. Capitalism versus communism, democracy versus authoritarianism, freedom versus security. These weren't just abstract concepts. They were the lenses through which the US and the Soviet Union viewed each other, the world, and the future. And through those lenses, everything the other side did looked suspicious, threatening, a step towards global domination. It's like two roommates with completely opposite lifestyles trying to share a tiny apartment, bound to lead to some serious tension, right? The Cold War's legacy is long and complicated. It shaped global politics for decades, leaving its fingerprints on everything from military alliances and the arms race to proxy wars fought in distant lands. Its shadow still lingers today. Think about the current tensions between the US and Russia, the the conflict in Ukraine. You can trace a direct line back to the mistrust and power struggles that took root in those crucial years after World War II. The Cold War reminds us that history isn't just a collection of dusty dates and names in a textbook. It's a story of human choices, of actions and reactions, of how fear and misunderstanding can drive even the closest allies apart. It's a story that continues to resonate today. What do you think? How does understanding the origins of the Cold War help us make sense of the world we live in now? Hit me up in the comments. Let's discuss. Thanks for watching History Deciphered with Nathan Gale.